The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt, cutting through the silence of the afternoon heat. Clara Monroe felt the lurch in her stomach, a familiar emptiness that had nothing to do with the rough journey. She waited until the other passengers, two drummers in sweat-stained suits, had climbed out before she gathered her meager bundle and stepped down onto the cracked earth of Red Bank. The town was little more than a single street of false-fronted buildings, baked brown by a sun that offered no mercy. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything. It was in her lungs, her hair, and the deep creases of her worn wool dress. She was 24 years old, but felt ancient, hollowed out by hunger and the long, fearful miles from home. For 3 days, she had eaten nothing but a stale biscuit handed to her by the driver. Her savings were gone, spent on the one-way ticket to this place, the last stop on the line, a border town clinging to the edge of civilization. She needed work. She needed it today. Clara clutched the handle of her reticule, the small, drawstring purse that held her last few coins and the folded, damning letter from Preacher Davies. It was all she had left. She started toward the plank sidewalk, her gaze sweeping the faces of the men lingering outside the saloon. They were hard-bitten, idle, and their eyes made her skin crawl. She lowered her head, trying to make herself small, invisible. She had taken perhaps 10 steps when a shadow fell over her. A man stumbled out of an alleyway, reeking of sour whiskey and desperation. He was large, unshaven, and his eyes, bloodshot and frantic, fixed immediately on her purse. "Give me that," he growled, lunging. His hand clamped onto the reticule. Clara's grip tightened instinctively. "No!" He yanked. The strings cut into her wrist, but she held on. This was not just money. It was her last thread of dignity, her only chance to eat, to find a room. The man cursed and tugged harder, spinning her around. A small crowd began to gather, but no one moved to help. They watched, entertained, as the drunken lout tried to wrestle the bag from the half-starved woman. "Let go, you witch!" he spat, and backhanded her across the face. The blow sent her stumbling. Stars exploded behind her eyes, and the taste of blood filled her mouth. But the pain ignited something hotter than fear. It ignited rage. She had not come this far, lost everything, to be broken in a dusty street by this brute. The man finally ripped the purse from her grasp and turned to run. Clara screamed, a raw sound torn from her throat. She looked down, her eyes landing on a loose, heavy rock near the edge of the boardwalk. Without a second thought, she snatched it up. She lifted her skirts and ran. She caught him in 3 strides, fueled by an adrenaline she did not know she possessed. She slammed the rock against the back of his shoulder. He howled and staggered. Dropping the purse, he turned to strike her again, but Clara was already on him. She kicked him in the shin, clawed at his face, and pounded on his chest with her small, balled fists. She was a whirlwind of desperation, heedless of her own safety, fighting like a cornered animal. Across the street, leaning against a veranda post in the shade, Callum Reed watched the entire thing unfold. He had seen her step off the coach, noted the exhaustion and the fear she tried to hide. He had seen worse arrivals and expected her to crumble. He did not expect her to fight. Callum was a man made of hard edges and quiet observation. Scars, white and silver, marked his face, reminders of a life that had taken more than it gave. A particularly vicious one cut from his left temple down across his neck, disappearing beneath the collar of his worn shirt. He had been in Red Bank for 2 weeks, drifting, winning just enough at the poker table each night to pay for his room and whiskey, and waiting for a sign of where to go next. He watched the woman attack the thief, her small frame vibrating with fury. She was going to get herself killed. The man, recovering from the surprise, raised a massive fist to silence her for good. Callum pushed off the post. He covered the distance in seconds. He did not shout or draw his gun. He simply grabbed the bandit's shoulder, spun him around, and drove his right fist into the man's jaw. It was one clean, brutal motion. The sound of bone connecting was dull and final. The bandit collapsed, unconscious, into the thick dust of the street. The sudden quiet was deafening. The onlookers stared. Clara stood frozen, her chest heaving, the rock still clutched in her hand. Her hair had fallen from its pins, and a dark bruise was already blooming on her cheek. Callum ignored the crowd. He bent down, picked up the small reticule, and dusted it off on his thigh. He walked over to her. He stopped a few feet away, respecting the wild, untamed fear still rolling off her. He held the purse out. "This yours, miss?" His voice was low, rough as gravel. Clara stared at the purse, then at his hand, then at his scarred face. His eyes were a flat, unreadable gray. He was just another dangerous man, one who had simply chosen a different target. She snatched the purse from his grip, pulling it protectively to her chest. "I didn't need your help," she whispered, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. Callum almost smiled. Almost. He looked at the 200-pound man lying senseless at his feet, then back at her. She weighed barely 100 pounds soaking wet. "My mistake," he said, touching the brim of his hat. He turned and walked away without another word, melting back into the shadows of the saloon. Clara stood alone in the street, trembling violently as the adrenaline drained away, leaving her weaker than before. She forced her legs to move, walking quickly toward the only sign that offered lodging, the Red Bank boarding house, clean beds, fair price. The boarding house was neither clean nor fairly priced, but it was all she had. The proprietor, a thin woman with a perpetually sour expression, took 2 of Clara's last $5 for a week's rent on a room that was little more than a closet under the eaves. That same evening, Callum Reed took a room in the same house. His was on the ground floor, near the back exit. He preferred it that way. The days fell into a harsh routine. Clara found work, not as a teacher. Her refined speech and educated manner made her an object of suspicion here, but as a seamstress for the town's tailor. He was a grasping man who paid her pennies to mend torn shirts and patch denim trousers for cowboys and miners. She worked from sunup until her fingers were raw and her eyes burned from the poor lamplight. She ate 1 meal a day, usually stale bread and thin soup, saving every cent. She spoke to no one, and no one spoke to her. Callum's life was lived by night. He emerged from his room as the sun set, walking to the Lucky Hand saloon. He played cards with a focused, cold intensity. He never drank more than 1 whiskey, never spoke unless spoken to, and always watched the other player's hands and the door. The scars on his face warned most men away from trying to cheat him. He won modest amounts, enough to survive, and returned to the boarding house in the early hours, a ghost in the quiet halls. They passed each other occasionally on the stairs. Clara would press herself against the wall, dropping her gaze, refusing to acknowledge him. Callum would nod curtly, his expression unchanging, and continue on his way. He admired her stubborn pride, the same fire he had seen in the street. She saw only his scars, his silence, and the casual violence he had displayed. She was terrified of him. 2 weeks after her arrival, the sky turned a sickening shade of yellow. The wind began to howl, a rising shriek that promised violence, a dust storm. One of the terrible prairie gales was bearing down on Red Bank. By nightfall, the town was plunged into a roaring, suffocating darkness. Sand and grit blasted against the thin walls of the boarding house. The wind found every crack, sending icy drafts through the building and making the oil lamps gutter wildly. Clara lay on her narrow cot, fully dressed, listening to the storm. It sounded like the world was ending. Her room was pitch black. The landlady had insisted all lamps be extinguished, fearing the wind would knock one over and set the tinder-dry building ablaze. Sometime after midnight, over the scream of the wind, she heard another sound, a crash. It came from the room next to hers, occupied by a quiet woman named Sadie, who worked in the saloon. Clara sat bolt upright, her heart hammering. Then came a man's voice, slurred and angry. "You think you can laugh at me? I paid for you." A woman's muffled cry, the sound of a struggle, of furniture toppling. Clara pressed her hands over her mouth. She knew Sadie's roomer was a rough miner who had been drinking heavily all day. He was going to kill her. Clara's door was thin, the lock flimsy. She heard a heavy thud against the wall separating their rooms. Sadie screamed, a short, choked-off sound. "Shut up!" the man roared. The violence was escalating. Clara scrambled off the bed, backing into the corner of her tiny room. Shaking, she had no rock this time, nowhere to run. Suddenly, the man bellowed again, but this time in surprise and pain. She heard a different sound, the door to Sadie's room splintering open. A new voice, low and cold, cut through the storm. "Get out." It was Callum. There was a brief, furious scuffle, the sickening sound of fists hitting flesh, a heavy body crashing to the floor. "I said," Callum's voice repeated, closer now. "Get out." The miner cursed, scrambled to his feet, and fled down the hallway, stumbling down the stairs. Silence returned, broken only by the wind and the sound of Sadie weeping hysterically in the next room. Clara slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She was crying, silent tears of pure terror carving paths through the dust on her cheeks. He had saved someone again. He had been right there, in the dark, listening. She heard a soft knock on her own door. "Miss Monroe." She flinched, stifling a sob. "Are you harmed?" Callum asked. His voice was just on the other side of the thin wood. She could not find her breath to answer. She just shook her head, a useless gesture in the blackness. A small sliver of light appeared at the bottom of the door. He had lit a match. A moment later, he spoke again, his voice softer. "I'm leaving a lamp out here for you. The storm's easing. You're safe." She heard the scrape of the lamp being set on the floor, then the sound of his footsteps retreating down the hall. Clara waited a long time before she crept to the door and eased it open. A small tin lamp sat on the floor, its flame casting a weak, golden circle in the dark hallway. She pulled it inside and bolted the door. She sat on her cot, bathed in the small light, and cried until her body ached. The next morning, Sadie was gone. Clara's hands shook so badly she could barely thread her needle. She knew she could not stay. Red Bank was not a refuge. It was a cage, and the predators were circling. That evening, she did not go to the tailor's. She waited at the bottom of the boarding house stairs. When Callum descended at his usual hour, his hat low, she stepped out of the shadows. He stopped, surprised to see her addressing him. "I'm Mr. Reed," she said, her voice small but firm. I owe you my thanks for last night." He nodded. "No thanks needed." He made to move past her. "Wait," she said, desperation making her bold. "Why did you help me that day in the street?" Callum paused, considering her. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a sickly yellow. She looked even thinner than when she arrived, but her eyes were still fierce. "You fought back," he said simply. "Most don't." Tears pricked her eyes, and she hated herself for them. She was so tired of being strong, so tired of being alone. Before she could stop herself, the words tumbled out. "I am not just a traveler," she whispered, the confession tearing from her. "I am running. I fled my home." Callum watched her, his expression giving nothing away. But he did not move. He listened. "I was a schoolteacher," she said, the shame burning in her. "In a small town in Missouri, I taught my girls to read, not just the Bible. I gave them books, poetry, Shakespeare." Her voice cracked. "Preacher Davies, He said the books were banned. He said they were sinful. He said I was corrupting the minds of the children. She looked down, unable to meet his gaze. He meant the boys. He said I was filling the girls' heads with ideas that made them tempting to the boys. He accused me, publicly, from the pulpit. The humiliation was as fresh as it had been that Sunday. The stares, the whispers, the way her fiancé, a bank clerk, had suddenly refused to know her name. He turned the entire town against me, she finished, her voice flat. They ran me out. If I had stayed, I do not know what they would have done. Callum was silent for a long moment. The noise of the street outside filtered in, a piano from the saloon, a drunken laugh. A preacher did that, he stated. It was not a question. He holds the town in his fist, she said, and he will not stop. He sent letters to the next towns. That is why I had to come this far, to the very edge of the map. But this place, she looked around the dingy hallway. It is no better. Callum looked at her, truly looked at her. For the first time, he saw the proud set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, and the sheer, terrified exhaustion she was fighting. She was a different kind of fighter from the one he had seen in the street, but a fighter nonetheless. This is no place for you, he agreed. West of here, there is nothing for 100 miles. And beyond that, territories where a name does not matter. Only what you can do. He had not planned this. He was a man who walked alone, but the sight of her, so thoroughly broken by the very civilization she represented, moved something in him. I am riding out tomorrow at dawn, he said, his voice flat, transactional. Heading west. You can ride with me. I have a pack mule. It can carry your things. Clara stared at him. The offer was madness. To ride into the wilderness with a scarred gambler, a man who settled arguments with his fists. It was the very thing she had been raised to fear. But then she thought of the preacher's cold eyes, the bandit's leering face, the miner's roar in the dark. She looked at Callum Reed. He was dangerous, she knew, but his danger seemed direct, honest. It was the world she knew, the world of polite society, that had betrayed her with whispers and lies. Why? She asked, suspicious. What do you want from me? Callum's gaze hardened. The emotional distance snapped back into place like a steel trap. I want nothing from you, Miss Monroe. The trail is hard, and it is safer with 2 sets of eyes. That is all. Clara saw the truth in his words, and it shamed her. I have no money to pay you. I am not asking for pay. She took a deep breath, the decision settling on her like a physical weight. Stay here and be devoured, or ride into the unknown with this man. All right, she said. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. I will come, but I want one thing understood. Mr. Reed. And what is that? We travel together for protection, not for companionship. We are partners in survival, nothing more. When we reach a town where I can be safe, we part ways. Am I clear? Callum looked at her for a long second. A flicker of something, amusement, or perhaps respect, in his gray eyes. Clear as glass. Miss Monroe. He nodded, put his hat back on, and walked out the door toward the saloon. Clara returned to her room and packed her few belongings. She did not sleep. At the first hint of gray light, she was downstairs. Callum was already there, standing by 2 saddled horses and a mule. He had bought her a horse, she realized, probably with his winnings from the night before. He handed her a canteen and a canvas sack with jerky and biscuits. He did not speak. He helped her mount, his hands strong and impersonal on her waist as he lifted her. They rode out of Red Bank just as the sun began to breach the horizon. The sky behind them was a raw, bleeding red. They did not look back. They rode west, 2 solitary figures against the vast, unforgiving land, the deep, uncertain silence stretching out between them. The world flattened into an endless expanse of bleached grass and cracked earth. They rode for days under a sun that felt like a physical weight, pressing the moisture from their bodies and the hope from their hearts. Clara had never known such emptiness. The sky was too large, the silence too deep. It swallowed her fears and her past, leaving only the immediate, aching present, the heat, the thirst, the burn of her thighs against the saddle. Callum Reed was a man of the trail. He moved through the landscape with a quiet economy of motion, wasting nothing, not a word, not a gesture. He rode ahead of her, his back a rigid line, his gaze constantly sweeping the horizon. He was not a companion. He was a guard. And Clara, true to her word, asked for nothing more. They spoke only of necessities. We stop here. Water the horses. Eat. At night, he would build a small, smokeless fire of dry brush. They would eat biscuits and jerky, the silence broken only by the crackle of the flames and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. He would lay out his bedroll a good 20 feet from hers, his back to her, his gun resting by his hand. Clara would wrap herself in her thin blanket, her own fear a cold companion, and watch the stars, so bright and indifferent, wheel across the black sky. After a week, the flatlands gave way to the sharp, sudden violence of canyons. The trail became a treacherous path winding between sheer rock walls, red and orange, that held the day's heat like an oven. One afternoon, Callum's horse threw a shoe on the sharp scree. He dismounted and began the laborious task of resetting it. Clara watched him work. His hands, which she had only ever seen as weapons or tools, moved with surprising dexterity. He was patient, whispering to the nervous horse, his voice low and soothing. When he finished, he wiped his brow, leaving a streak of grime. He winced as he flexed his right hand. Clara slid off her own horse. "You are bleeding," she said. He glanced at his hand. A long, shallow cut, likely from the sharp edge of the shoe, was weeping blood into his palm. "It is nothing." "It will fester," she insisted. She walked to her saddlebag and pulled out her small sewing kit. From it, she took a bottle of whiskey she had bought in Red Bank for just such a purpose, and a small, clean piece of linen, torn from the edge of her last good petticoat. She walked up to him. "Give it to me." He hesitated. Trust did not come easily to him, but he saw the set of her jaw, the same stubbornness he had admired in Red Bank, and he slowly, reluctantly, held out his hand. She poured the whiskey over the cut. He did not flinch, but his muscles tensed. She cleaned the wound with a deliberate, gentle touch, her fingers brushing his calloused skin. The contact was shocking, the first time they had touched for any reason other than necessity. She focused on the task, wrapping the linen tightly around his palm. "You will need to change this tomorrow," she said, her voice clinical, as if she were still in a schoolroom. "Thank you, Miss Monroe." His voice was gruff. "It was practical. Mr. Reed, I cannot have my guide disabled." He took his hand back, flexing his bandaged fingers. He looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable, and then turned back to his horse. But the small act had shifted something. A debt had been acknowledged. A piece of unspoken humanity passed between them. That night, the air grew colder. Callum managed to shoot a scrawny rabbit with his rifle, the single shot echoing and dying in the vast stillness. He skinned it and roasted it over the fire. When it was cooked, he tore the meat apart with his one good hand and the other, handing her the larger portion on a piece of flat rock. Clara ate, the meat savory and hot, a welcome change from the dry, salted rations. She watched him eat his smaller share, his gaze fixed on the fire. The silence between them felt different tonight, less empty, more weighted. "The scars," she said, the words surprising her. He looked up, his face thrown into sharp relief by the flames. The long, white line across his neck seemed to pulse in the firelight. "The one on your face," she clarified, her voice soft.
Was it prison?
Callum stopped chewing. He placed the remaining piece of meat down. He stared into the darkness beyond the fire for a long time. Clara regretted speaking, fearing she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. "No," he said finally. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "That was my father. The prison came later." Clara remained silent, her own breath caught in her throat. "I spent 5 years in Yuma," he said, still not looking at her, "for killing a man." The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. Clara thought of the bandit, of the miner in the boarding house. She had seen his capacity for violence, but murder. "It was a bar brawl," he continued, his voice a low monotone. "In a town outside Tucson, a young man full of whiskey and pride. He was the son of a powerful rancher. He liked to push men. He pushed me." He picked up a stick and poked at the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the night. "He drew on me. He was fast, but he was drunk. I was faster." He looked at his bandaged hand. "I told the judge it was self-defense. Witnesses said it was, but his father owned the town, the judge and the jury. They called it murder." He tossed the stick into the fire. 5 years in a box made of rock and heat. 5 years listening to men scream. I got out 2 months ago." He finally turned to look at her. His gray eyes were not cold now. They were hollow, filled with a past she could not possibly understand. "So now you know. Miss Monroe, you are riding with a killer." Clara looked at him, at the man who had saved her twice, who had given her the larger share of his meal, who had accepted her care with a quiet reluctance. "You said it was self-defense." She said, "I did." "I believe you," she said. It was the truth. She had seen the arrogance of powerful men, seen how they twisted the truth to suit their needs. Preacher Davies and the rancher, they were cut from the same cloth. A kind of understanding passed between them. He had offered her the worst part of himself, and she had not flinched. Now it was her turn. "I told you about the preacher," she began, her own voice barely a whisper. "But I did not tell you everything." She looked down at her hands, twisting the fabric of her skirt. "I had a fiancé. His name was Silas. He worked at the town bank. He was ambitious. When the preacher first noticed me, Silas was proud. He thought the preacher's attention would be good for his career." She swallowed, the memory thick and bitter in her throat. "When Preacher Davies turned on me, when he stood at the pulpit and called me a corrupter, a temptress. Silas was the first to cast a stone. He stood up in the congregation and said he had seen the signs of my vanity, my unwomanly thoughts. He said it to save himself, to save his position at the bank." Callum's expression darkened, but he said nothing. "He did not just abandon me," Clara whispered, the tears she had refused to shed for weeks finally burning in her eyes. "He betrayed me. He led the men who came to my schoolhouse that night. They burned my books. They tore the maps from the walls. They broke everything I had built." She paused. "I lost my job. I lost my home. I lost the man I thought I loved. And I nearly lost my life." She was shaking now, the cold of the memory seeping into her bones. "That is why I fight," she said, looking up at him, her eyes fierce despite the tears. "Because I have learned that no one else will fight for me." Callum watched her for a long moment. He did not offer empty comfort. He did not tell her it would be all right. He simply nodded, a slow, grave acknowledgement of her pain. He saw her, not as a victim, but as a survivor, just like him. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out his own bedroll, tossing it onto the ground near the fire. He then picked hers up and moved it closer. Still a respectful distance, but inside the small, safe circle of the firelight. "Get some sleep, Clara," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. "I will take the first watch." A few nights later, the land changed again. They entered a high plateau, sparsely wooded and cold. The air was thin, and the silence was absolute. Too absolute. Callum, who had been quiet but less rigid since their confessions, suddenly reined in his horse. "Get down," he whispered, his voice urgent. Clara dismounted, her heart leaping into her throat.
What is it?
"The horses, they smell them."
Smell what?
And then she heard it, a low, long howl that raised the hair on her arms. It was answered by another, closer this time, and then a chorus of yips and cries. "Wolves," Callum said, his voice grim. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard. "A large pack. They are hungry." They were caught in the open, with only a few stunted pines for cover. The sun was bleeding away, staining the western sky a deep, bruised purple. "Gather all the dry wood you can find," Callum ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. "Quickly! We need a large fire. Go!" Clara ran, her skirts tangling in the brush, grabbing at dead branches, twigs, anything that would burn. Callum worked on the horses, tying them short to a low branch and unloading the packs to form a meager barricade. By the time true darkness fell, they were trapped in a small circle of firelight. Callum had built the fire up into a blazing roar, just beyond its reach. Pairs of yellow-green eyes glittered in the blackness. They circled, silent as ghosts, shadows moving against shadows. Clara sat with her back against a saddle, her knees drawn up, trying not to scream. The pack was bold. They darted in, testing the perimeter of the light, their snarls audible over the crackling flames. "How many?" she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Too many," Callum said. He stood between her and the darkness, his rifle in his hand. "Maybe 10, 12. He threw more wood on the fire. It blazed, and the wolves retreated for a moment. "We do not have enough wood to last the night," Clara said, her voice trembling. "We will make it last," he said. An hour passed, then 2. The fire began to die down. The circle of eyes crept closer. One large gray wolf, bolder than the rest, darted in. It snapped at the air, its teeth clicking. Callum fired. The explosion of the rifle was deafening. The wolf yelped and fell. The others scattered, but only for a moment. The scent of blood made them crazier, more determined. "That was a mistake," Callum hissed, reloading. "Should have saved the bullet." The pack regrouped, howling, a frenzied, terrifying sound. They began to rush the camp in short, aggressive lunges. Clara could not bear it. She scrambled to her feet and moved to Callum's side, grabbing his arm with both hands. She pressed her face against his shoulder, her body shaking so violently she could barely stand. Callum stiffened at her touch, his entire body going rigid, but he did not push her away. He put his arm around her, pulling her tight against his side. "Stay behind me," he ordered, "and do not scream." She clung to him, her knuckles white. He smelled of sweat, leather, and wood smoke. He was solid and warm in a world that had dissolved into cold and terror. They stood like that for hours, a single, besieged figure in the vast, dark wilderness. Callum fed the fire with one hand, his rifle in the other, and Clara hidden against his side. When the first gray light of dawn finally broke the horizon, the wolves were gone. They had melted away with the darkness, leaving only the one body and a ring of tracks in the dirt. Clara was boneless with exhaustion and relief. She was still holding onto Callum's shirt, her face pressed into his chest. She slowly loosened her grip, stepping back. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and tears.
I am sorry,
she stammered, deeply embarrassed.
I was...
You were scared, he said. He looked exhausted, the skin around his eyes tight. Any sane person would be... He turned to check on the horses, which were trembling and lathered in a cold sweat. Clara watched him, his movements stiff. He had stood between her and death all night. He had held her and kept her safe. She did not know what came over her. It was not thought. It was not reason. It was a purely physical impulse, a desperate need to affirm that they were alive, that he was real. She walked up to him as he was calming his horse. He turned to look at her, a question in his eyes. Clara reached up, put her hands on his rough, unshaven cheeks, stood on her toes, and pressed her mouth to his. It was brief, chaste, and desperately clumsy. His lips were dry. Surprised. For 1 second, he did not move, did not respond. Then Clara's mind caught up with her actions. Horror washed over her. She dropped her hands as if she had been burned, stumbling back.
Oh,
She gasped, her hands flying to her own mouth. Mr. Reed, Callum, I apologize. I do not know. I was not thinking. I am so sorry. She turned and fled to the other side of the camp, her face burning with a shame far deeper than anything the preacher had ever inflicted. She had acted like a wanton. She had forced herself on him, on her protector. Callum stood frozen for a long minute, his fingers tracing the scar on his neck. He did not say a word. The tension between them for the next few days was a palpable, painful thing. The silence was back, but it was no longer empty. It was charged with her guilt and his confusion. He moved his bedroll even farther from hers, back to the 20-foot distance of their first nights. He was polite, but his voice was clipped, his eyes averted. Clara was miserable. She was ashamed of her weakness, but beneath the shame, a new, more confusing feeling simmered. She found herself watching him. She watched the way the sun caught the lines by his eyes, the way his shoulders moved under his shirt as he rode. She found herself dreaming of him, dreams that were not chaste, dreams that left her waking in the cold dark with a flush on her skin and a deeper guilt in her heart. She feared, exactly the corrupted woman the preacher had accused her of being. They rode into a remote mining town after 3 more days. It was not a town, but a wound in the earth, a collection of muddy tents, crude shacks, and one long, false-fronted building that served as saloon, general store, and post office. It was loud, filthy, and overflowing with men who had not seen a woman in months. Clara pulled her bonnet low, trying to make herself invisible. "We need supplies," Callum said, his voice all business. "Flour, salt, and cartridges. Stay by the horses."
no.
Clara said, her chin jutting out. She was tired of cowering.
I am coming with you. I will not be left alone.
Callum's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Stay close." They pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon, the smell of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and despair hit them like a wall. A piano tinkled badly in the corner. Every man in the room, dozens of them, stopped and stared at Clara. Callum put a hand on the butt of his revolver, his gaze sweeping the room, a silent warning. He moved to the bar, where the store was located. "Need supplies," he said to the bartender. Clara stood a few feet behind him, her back to the wall, trying to ignore the whispers, the crude, appreciative murmurs. 2 miners, drunk at 10 in the morning, detached themselves from a table and swaggered over to her. "Well, look what we got here." One of them slurred. He was a big man with a matted beard and missing teeth. "Lost your way, little lady."
Please leave me alone,
Clara said, her voice trembling but cold.
"Oh, she talks,"
the second man laughed, circling her. "I like 'em when they talk. What is your name? Sweetheart?" The first man reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh. "Come have a drink with us. We are celebrating." "Take your hand off me," Clara spat, trying to pull away. Callum had finished his transaction. He turned, his body coiling like a snake. He did not say a word. He did not need to. He moved, faster than Clara thought a man could move. He grabbed the miner's wrist and twisted. The man screamed as bone grated. The second miner, seeing his friend in trouble, swung a clumsy fist at Callum's head. Callum ducked under the punch, letting go of the first man. He did not draw his gun to shoot. He drew it to strike. He brought the heavy steel butt of the revolver up in a vicious arc, striking the first miner squarely across the jaw. The sound was sickening. The man crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Callum leveled the barrel of the gun at the second man's chest. The miner froze, his hands raised. The entire saloon was dead silent. "Apologize to the lady," Callum said, his voice a lethal whisper.
I am sorry, miss,"
the man stammered, his eyes wide with fear. "Now get him," Callum pointed to the man on the floor, "and get out of my sight." The man grabbed his friend's arm and dragged him out of the saloon. Callum calmly tucked his revolver back into its holster. He picked up his sack of flour. The bartender, his face pale, held up his hands. "No trouble here, mister. Just go. We do not want your kind here." Callum looked at the man. "We paid for our supplies. And you got 'em. Now leave, before the whole camp comes down on you." Callum nodded once. He grabbed Clara's elbow. "Let's go." They walked out into the muddy street, mounted their horses, and rode out of town, the eyes of every man following them. They rode for 2 hours, the cold biting at them, the sky promising snow. They found a long-abandoned barn, its roof half collapsed, but its walls still solid. They led the horses inside, the smell of old hay and rot filling their lungs. Callum began to unsaddle the horses, his movements sharp and angry. Clara slid off her mount and leaned against a support beam. The adrenaline from the saloon drained away, leaving her hollow. And then the dam broke. She slid down the beam until she was sitting on the dirt floor, buried her face in her hands, and began to sob. It was not the quiet, frightened weeping of the boarding house. It was a raw, racking storm of grief, a sound of utter breakage. Callum froze. He stood by his horse, watching her, his face a mask of confusion and helplessness.
"I cannot do this,"
she gasped, the words torn from her.
"I cannot. I run, and they find me. I hide, and they find me. I am tired. I am so tired of being hunted, so tired of being judged."
She looked up at him, her face a mess of tears and dirt. "Do you see how they look at me? They see me as something spoiled, something to be used. First the preacher, then those men, even you. You must think." She could not finish. She dropped her head to her knees, her shoulders shaking. Callum stood awkwardly for a long, painful minute. He was a man of action, not words. He did not know how to comfort. He slowly walked over and sat on a broken crate near her, not touching her, just sitting in the cold, dusty air. He waited until her sobs began to quiet, until she was just shivering, her breath catching in her chest. "You are wrong," he said, his voice quiet. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "How they see you, that is their own filth," he said, searching for the words. "It is not yours." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I have been in this world a long time. Clara, I have seen men break over a bad hand of cards. I have seen them cry because their whiskey was watered down. I have seen strong men turn to animals over nothing." He looked at her, his gray eyes steady and clear. "You lost everything, your home, your name, your life. You were starved, beaten by a thief, and you still got up and fought him with a rock. You were hunted by wolves, and you did not collapse. You just got harassed by 2 brutes, and you told him to take his hand off you before I ever moved." He shook his head, a small, slow motion. "You are the bravest woman I have ever met. You are not spoiled. You are a survivor." Clara stared at him. Her tears stopped. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever seen her. They saw a fallen teacher, a target, a burden. Callum saw a fighter. The barn was growing dark. Outside, the first fat flakes of snow began to drift down, silent and white, visible through the gaps in the roof. The cold was intense. Callum stood up and began spreading out their bedrolls on a thick pile of old, dry hay in a sheltered corner. He laid them side by side. Clara watched him. The air between them was charged, but the tension was different. Her shame from the kiss was gone, burned away by his words. His distance was gone, replaced by a raw, open honesty. He finished and stood, not looking at her. "It will be too cold to sleep apart," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "The snow is here." Clara stood up on shaky legs. She walked over to the bedrolls. He was right. The cold was already seeping into her bones, and the barn offered little more than a windbreak. But it was more than that. She was tired of being alone. She was so tired. She sat on one bedroll and began to unlace her boots. Callum sat on the other, his back to her, and did the same. He pulled off his gun belt and laid it beside him. She lay down, pulling the blanket up to her chin, her body rigid. He lay down beside her, on top of his own blanket, his hands folded on his chest. They lay in the darkness for a long time, two separate, lonely people, listening to the snow whisper against the old wood.
"Callum,"
she whispered to the darkness.
"Yes."
"Thank you." He did not answer. Another hour passed. The cold was agonizing. Clara was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. "You are freezing," he stated.
"So are you,"
she whispered. He was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, he turned onto his side, facing her. In the faint, snowy light, she could just make out the outline of his scarred face. He reached out and pulled her blanket, drawing her closer, until her back was pressed against his chest. He draped his own heavy blanket over both of them, creating a cocoon of shared warmth. He wrapped one arm around her waist, holding her gently, his hand resting on her stomach. Clara's entire body was stiff. This was more intimate than the kiss, more dangerous than the wolves. But he did not move, did not press, did not demand. He just held her, offering his warmth, slowly, muscle by muscle. Clara began to relax. His body was hard and warm behind her. His breath was steady on the back of her neck. For the first time since she had left her home, she felt safe. Not just protected, but truly, deeply safe. She let her eyes close, and for the first time in months, she did not dream of running. She drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep, held in the arms of the killer who had called her brave, while the snow fell, blanketing the barn, the town, and all the hard miles behind them. Clara woke to a faint, gray light. The first thing she registered was warmth. It was a profound, enveloping heat that seemed to soak into her bones. The second was the solid weight of an arm draped over her waist, and the steady, slow breath of another person against her hair. She was pressed against Callum's back, her front fitted to him like a spoon. His arm held her firmly, possessively, in his sleep. The intimacy of it, after the terror of the barn, sent a jolt through her that was half panic, half something else, something new and frighteningly soft. She lay perfectly still, her heart hammering. The barn was freezing. Outside, the world was silent, muffled by the new snow. She could see her breath, a small white cloud in the air, but where their bodies touched, she was warmer than she had been in months. Callum stirred, his breathing changing. The arm around her waist tensed, then loosened. He did not move away, not immediately. He just lay there, awake, his back to her. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, filled with the unspoken reality of what had happened. They had not just shared a bedroll. They had clung to each other through the dark. Finally, his voice, low and rough. "You cold?" "No," she whispered. He pulled his arm away slowly, as if it pained him, and rolled to his feet in one fluid motion. He turned his back to her, raking a hand through his hair, and walked to the barn door. He pushed it open a crack, letting in a sliver of blinding white light. "Snow stopped," he said, his voice all business again, but with a strained edge. "We can travel." Clara sat up, pulling the blankets around her, her skin prickling at the loss of his heat. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. They had crossed a line, and neither of them knew the rules on this new terrain. They packed in silence, the air between them thick with things unsaid. When he handed her the canteen, his fingers brushed hers, and they both pulled back as if scalded. He saddled the horses, his movements quick and efficient, his face a mask. Clara felt a strange, sharp pang of loss. The safety she had felt in his arms was gone, replaced by this brittle, awkward distance. They rode out into a world made new. The snow was a foot deep, a pristine, glittering blanket that covered the filth of the mining camp and the harshness of the land. It was beautiful, but it was treacherous. The going was slow, the horses struggling, the air thin and sharp as glass in their lungs. By midday, the sky had turned a flat, bruised gray. The wind picked up, howling down from the peaks, driving sharp needles of ice into their faces. It was no longer just snow, it was a blizzard. Within an hour, they were blind. The world was a churning, roaring vortex of white. "We cannot stay out in this," Callum yelled over the wind, pulling his horse alongside hers. "We will freeze." He grabbed her reins, leading her horse. Clara simply bent her head, trusting him. She could not see him, only the dark shape of his horse's rump in front of her. They moved slowly, climbing, the wind tearing at them. "There!" he shouted, pointing. Clara squinted, her eyelashes caked with ice. Through the white swirl, she saw a dark shape, a structure. It was a small cabin, built of thick logs, nestled in a stand of tall pines, snow piled high against its walls. A ranger outpost, long abandoned. Callum kicked open the frozen door. His gun drawn, the cabin was empty. Just one small dark room, a stone hearth black with old soot, a broken table, and 2 rotted bunks. But it was shelter. It was solid. They stumbled inside, leading the horses into the small, attached lean-to. Callum slammed the door against the storm, and the world went from a deafening roar to a muffled, eerie silence. "We are trapped," Clara said, her voice shaking, as she slid from the saddle, her legs numb. "We are alive," Callum said. He moved to the hearth. "There is wood, stacked against the back wall, dry." They worked together, their hands clumsy with cold. He built a fire, and she unpacked their meager supplies. They had flour, coffee, salt, and the last of the jerky. It was not much. The storm raged. For 3 days, the wind screamed, a living thing trying to claw its way in. The small cabin became their entire world. They rationed the food. Callum would melt snow for coffee, and Clara would make a thin gruel of flour and water, which they ate from the single tin plate they shared. The forced proximity was a new kind of prison, but also a strange kind of intimacy. There was nowhere to hide. They slept in their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, the small space between them a charged territory. And they talked, the way they had in the canyon, but deeper, with no trail to watch, no destination to reach. There was nothing left but the past. 5 years, Callum said, staring into the flames one night, the storm shrizzling in the chimney. "You know what that does to a man?" Clara watched him. His face was leaner in the firelight, the scars stark. "You forget what it is to be a man. You are just a number. You are just an animal in a cage. They feed you, they work you, and they beat you. The first year, you are angry. The second, you are just tired. By the 5th, he shook his head. By the 5th, you forget. You forget what a woman's voice sounds like. You forget what a clean bed feels like. You forget touch." He looked at his hands,
the one she had bandaged. When I got out, a man bumped into me on the street. I almost killed him, not because I was angry, because I did not remember how to be touched without it meaning violence. He looked at her, his gray eyes raw. That barn, when I held you, it was the first time in more than 5 years I had touched someone, and it was not to hurt or be hurt. Clara's heart ached for him. She saw the man beneath the scars, the man who had been buried alive in that hot stone box. "And you, Clara?" he asked, his voice soft. "The preacher, the fiancé, do you ever think of forgiveness?" Clara bristled. "Forgive them, after what they did?" "Not for them," he said. "For you. You carry them. I see it. You carry that preacher on your back every mile we ride, just like I carry that rancher's son." She thought about it. She thought about Silas, his weak chin, his desperate eyes as he betrayed her. "He was a coward," she whispered. I do not hate him. I despise him. I hate that I believed him. I hate that I was so foolish." "That is not foolishness," Callum said. "That is trust. It is what people are supposed to do." "And look where it got me," she said bitterly. "It got me run out of my home. It got me called a harlot for teaching poetry. It got you here," he said quietly. "You survived it." They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. The storm was their jailer, but it was also their confessor. They were two broken halves, trapped in a box, and they were beginning to see themselves in each other's jagged edges. The supplies ran lower. The jerky was gone. They were down to half a bag of flour and the last of the coffee. The hunger made them weak, but it sharpened their senses. Every look, every accidental brush of hands as they tended the fire, became magnified. The tension that had started in the barn was back, but it was no longer awkward. It was a low, simmering heat, a silent acknowledgement of the man and woman they were. On the fourth night, the storm seemed to fall into a deeper, more violent rage. The wind sounded like a freight train, and the cabin shuddered. They had eaten their last portion of flour paste and were sitting by the fire, the hunger a dull ache in their stomachs. Clara was restless. She was tired of being cold, tired of being hungry, tired of being afraid. She was tired of just surviving. She looked at Callum. He was staring into the fire, his profile hard and lonely. He was a man who had forgotten how to be touched. She thought of his words. She thought of his arm around her in the barn, the feeling of absolute safety, a safety that had felt more real than anything in her old life. She was done running. She was done being the victim. She stood up from her bedroll. Callum looked at her, his eyes questioning in the dim light. She crossed the small space between them and knelt in front of him. She did not kiss him. She simply reached out and laid her hand on his chest, over his heart. She could feel it beat, steady and strong, beneath her palm. His entire body went rigid. His breath hitched. "Clara," he whispered, his voice a warning. He put his hand over hers, not to push it away, but to stop her. "Do not. You are not. You are cold. You are scared. You are grateful. This ain't—" "I am not grateful," she said, her voice shaking but fierce. She looked him directly in the eye. "And I am not cold. Not right now." She leaned in, her other hand coming up to touch his scarred cheek. "Callum, I am so tired of being safe. I want to feel alive." His hesitation broke. He looked at her, truly saw her. The want in her eyes, the choice she was making. It was not desperation, it was a claiming. He cupped the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair, and pulled her to him. His kiss was not gentle, it was rough, hungry, and full of all the years of loneliness and pain he had stored up. It was a drowning, and she met him with a ferocity that matched his own. This was not the clumsy, apologetic kiss of the wolf camp. This was a fire. She clung to him, her hands moving from his chest to his shoulders, pulling him closer. He tasted of coffee and wood smoke and the faint,
metallic tang of hunger. He broke the kiss to look at her, his eyes dark with a desire that was almost painful to see. "Are you sure?" he breathed. She did not answer with words. She kissed him again, pulling him down with her onto his bedroll, the rough wool scratching her skin through her thin dress. Their movements were urgent, almost desperate, a fight against the cold, against the storm, against the ghosts of their pasts. They shed their clothes with shaking hands, the firelight casting flickering shadows over their bodies. He looked at her, his gaze reverent and raw. She was not ashamed. He touched her as if he were memorizing her, his calloused fingers tracing her ribs, her hip, the line of her throat. And when he finally came inside her, it was with a groan that seemed torn from his very soul. It was a slow, deep claiming, a promise, and a release. Clara wept, not from pain or sadness, but from the sheer, overwhelming relief of being touched, of being held, of being alive. They did not sleep. The blizzard raged around them, but inside the small cabin, they had created their own world, a small, hot center of life. They made love again, this and again, slowly this time, then with a fierce, consuming urgency. It was a rediscovery of everything they had been denied. For him, the softness of a woman's skin, the smell of her hair. For her, the feeling of being wanted, not for what she represented, but for who she was. They were two outcasts, two survivors, and in the heart of the storm, they found a fierce, brutal solace in each other's arms. The storm broke on the 6th day. They woke to a profound, shocking silence. Callum opened the door. The world was a blinding, pristine white. The sun was shining, making the snow glitter like a field of diamonds. The air was clean, cold, and still. The dream was over. The real world was back. They packed what little they had. The intimacy of the cabin felt distant, a fever dream. They were shy with each other, their bodies sore, their emotions raw. They rode down from the mountain, the horses sinking to their bellies in the drifts, the silence between them heavy again, but in a new way. By the next afternoon, they reached a small trading post at a fork in a frozen river. It was a squat building of raw lumber, a thin plume of smoke rising from its chimney. "We need food," Callum said. His voice was practical, but his eyes lingered on her. "And ammunition. I will see what I can trade." They went inside. The post was dark, smelling of cured pelts, tobacco, and dried fish. A few grizzled trappers watched them, their eyes lingering on Clara. Callum put his hand on her back, a small, proprietary gesture that made her skin tingle. While Callum bartered with the post owner, offering a few of his spare cartridges for flour and bacon, Clara moved around the small space. Her eyes fell on a wall near the door, covered with papers, notices of land sales, crude drawings of stolen livestock, and other notices. Her gaze snagged on one. It was a printed sheet, the ink slightly blurred. Her blood went cold. "Wanted." She stepped closer, her heart beginning to pound. There was no drawing, just words. "For the murder of Elias Vance Jr." And then the name. Callum Reed. Her eyes scanned the rest of the text, her mind struggling to make sense of it. It was not just a simple wanted poster. It offered a reward. $500. A fortune. Enough to make any man in this post turn on him. The poster was signed by Elias Vance Sr. This was not the state. This was not the law. This was a bounty. This was a rich man's vendetta. She tore it from the wall, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the paper. Callum finished his trade. He turned, a small sack in his hand. He saw her face, saw the paper, and his expression went flat. The warmth from the cabin vanished, replaced by the cold. Hard man from Red Bank. She waited until they were outside, behind the building, By the horses. The trappers were still watching. "Clara," he began. She held up the paper. It trembled in her hand.
"You lied to me?"
Her voice was a choked whisper. "I did not," he said, his voice hard. "I told you I killed a man. I told you I went to prison for it." "You did not tell me this," she cried, shaking the poster at him.
"This is not prison. Callum, this is a bounty. $500. The man you killed. He was from a powerful family."
The anger faded, replaced by a sudden, sickening wave of fear. "They are not just letting you go. They are hunting you. That is what you were running from, not just the prison. You are still running." The anger left her, replaced by tears of terror and betrayal.
"You should have told me. You should have told me it was this serious. Every man we meet, every town we enter,
they will be looking for you. For that money." "It does not change anything," he said, his jaw tight.
"It changes everything."
She threw the poster into the snow.
"You did not just bring me along for protection. You brought me along as what? A distraction?"
"Did you think no one would look twice at a man traveling with a woman?" It was a cruel thing to say, and she knew it, but she was hurt, and she was terrified. "That is not true," he growled, his own anger rising. He was angry at the poster, at the Vances, at her fear.
"Is it not?"
she sobbed.
"That fight in the saloon, was that just protecting me, or was it you, waiting for a fight, drawing attention to us, to me?"
He flinched as if she had struck him. He said nothing. He just turned, grabbed the reins of his horse, and swung into the saddle. He waited for her. The ride from the trading post was silent and miserable. The connection they had forged in the fire and darkness of the outpost was broken, shattered by the cold, hard reality of $500. That night, they made camp in a frozen thicket. He built the fire, his movements jerky and angry. She sat on the other side, wrapped in her blanket, watching him. The man who had held her, who had whispered her name in the dark, was gone. In his place was a fugitive, a hunted man. She felt a devastating, cold pity for him and for herself. She was tied to him now, not by choice, but by this new, shared danger. But it was his danger, not hers. She was hunted by a preacher. He was hunted by a clan with money and power. She watched him as he took the first watch, his back to her, his rifle across his knees, staring into the darkness. She saw his future, a lifetime of looking over his shoulder, a lifetime of running, a quick, violent death in a muddy street over a handful of coins. And what would happen to her? She would be the woman who was with him, the killer's whore. The thought made her sick. She could not. She had run from one ruined reputation. She could not willingly ride into another. She thought of his words. "You deserve more than someone hunted." He had meant her, but as she looked at his rigid, lonely back, she knew it was true of him, too. He deserved more than this, and he deserved more than her. She was a liability. She brought him trouble. She was the one who was recognized, who was harassed. Without her, he could move faster, be invisible. Her heart broke. The man who had called her brave, the man who had made her feel alive, she was going to kill him. She waited. She waited for 2 agonizing hours, until she was sure he was asleep. He was not. He was on watch, but he moved away from the fire, walking the perimeter of the camp, a dark shadow against the snow. Her body moved with a desperate, quiet speed. She scribbled a note on the last piece of clean paper she owned, the back of a letter from her old life. She took her saddlebag, a small portion of the new food, and her bedroll. She crept to the horses. She untied hers, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the knot. She mounted, the creak of the leather sounding as loud as a gunshot. She looked back at the fire. He was still gone, lost in the shadows. She nudged the horse, turning it back toward the trading post. She would go in the other direction at the fork. She would disappear. She left the note weighted by a rock, near his bedroll, where he would find it. Just 7 words, the only truth she had left. You deserve more than someone hunted. The horse stumbled, catching itself on the icy crust of the snow, and Clara whispered a desperate apology into the wind. She was riding too hard, pushing the animal beyond its endurance, but the image of the wanted poster was burned behind her eyelids. $500. She was a fool, a blind, trusting fool. She had let herself believe, in the warm, desperate dark of that mountain cabin, that they were just two people. She had forgotten that they were a killer and a runaway. She had let him comfort her, let him touch her, all while he was a hunted man. Clara pulled her thin coat tighter. The wind was relentless, a physical thing that shoved and tore at her. She had ridden through the night, doubling back toward the trading post, her mind a frantic whirl. She would take the South Fork, the one they had ignored, and ride until the horse gave out. Then she would walk. She would find a town, a different town, a place where no one knew her name or his. It was not her own safety she feared. It was his. She was the one who drew attention. The men in the mining camp saloon had not looked at him twice, not until they looked at her. She was the weakness, the liability, traveling with her. A woman alone. He was conspicuous. Without her, he was just another shadow, another drifter. He could disappear. You deserve more than someone hunted. She had written the note with a frozen hand, the words a confession of her own guilt. By staying with him, she was painting a target on his back, and she was the one holding the brush. The thought of him being shot, of those cold-eyed trappers at the post putting a bullet in his back for money, made her sick with a fear she had never known. This was worse than the preacher, worse than the wolves. This was a fear that had a name and a price. She rode for hours, the white, endless landscape blurring through her frozen tears. She was so cold, so tired, and so utterly alone. Callum returned to the fire to find it dying. The camp was empty. The silence was immediate and absolute, a sudden, cold vacuum. He saw her note, weighted by the rock, his name not even on it. He read the 7 words, and the paper crumpled in his fist. The ice in his gut had nothing to do with the snow. It was a familiar cold. It was the feeling of a steel door clanging shut. It was the echo of the judge's voice. It was the sight of his father's back as he walked away. Abandoned. He had been left to rot again. He looked at the snow. The tracks were clear, sharp in the dawn light. One horse heading east, back toward the post. A black, furious energy surged through him. He had been a fool. He had let his guard down. He had allowed himself to feel, for the first time in 6 years, something other than anger or the dull need to survive. He had held her. He had kissed her. He had spilled his guts to her in that cabin, told her things he had never told another living soul. And at the first sign of real trouble, the first sign of his trouble, she ran, just like everyone else. He did not believe her note. He did not believe it was for his own good. It was fear. She was scared of the bounty, scared of what it meant to be with him. She had run from the preacher, and now she was running from him. He moved with a deadly, focused speed. He kicked snow onto the fire, saddled his horse, and gathered all their supplies, lashing her bedroll and the extra food onto his mule. When he found her, she would not be able to run again. He tracked her easily. She was riding hard but sloppy, not thinking about concealment. He saw where her horse had stumbled, where she had paused at a frozen creek. He gained on her quickly. He was a better rider, his horse stronger, and he was fueled by a cold rage that burned hotter than any fire. He would find her. He would drag her back if he had to. He would not be left. Clara heard the voices before she saw the men. She had just cleared a ridge, entering a small, wooded valley, when the sound of them, laughing and cursing, carried on the wind. She pulled her horse into a thicket of pine, her heart leaping into her throat. Trappers, she thought, or miners. She just needed to stay hidden. Let them pass. But they were not passing. They were making camp. She watched through the branches as 3 men dismounted near a small, frozen creek. They were not trappers. They were dressed in cheap town suits and thin coats, men wholly unsuited for this weather. They looked cold, angry, and mean. One of them, a thick-set man with a heavy, drooping mustache, looked up from his horse. His eyes scanned the ridge, and, impossibly, they settled directly on her. "Well, now," he called out, a cruel smile splitting his face. "Look what we have here. Hiding, Miss Monroe?" Clara's blood turned to ice. He knew her name. She yanked her horse's reins, trying to turn back up the ridge, but the snow was too deep, the horse too tired. The men were on her in seconds. One grabbed her bridle, his grip like a steel trap. "Get down," he ordered.
"Who are you?"
Clara demanded, her voice shaking but her eyes defiant. "Friends of Preacher Davies," the man with the mustache said. He walked up and stared at her, his eyes crawling over her. "He has been very worried about you, sent us all this way to bring you home." "I am not going back," Clara said, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife Callum had given her, but it was in her saddlebag, out of reach. "Oh, you are going back," the man sneered. "The preacher wants a public penance. Seems you have become something of a legend. The fallen woman of Missouri. He wants to make an example of you." Another man, younger and thinner, laughed. "We have been tracking you since Red Bank. Asked at that trading post back there. They said you was with that killer, Reed. Where is he? Did you finally poison him in his sleep?" "Let me go!" Clara spat, trying to dismount on the far side. But the man with the mustache grabbed her by the arm and hauled her from the saddle. She fell hard into the snow. He stood over her. "You are not in a position to give orders. Missy, you have caused us a great deal of trouble. A long, cold ride. I think we deserve some compensation before we drag you all the way back to that hypocrite." The other men chuckled, their eyes dark. Clara scrambled backward, her heart suffocating her. She had run from one predator only to be caught by another. "Get her on her feet," the leader ordered. "Tie her hands. We will rest here, and then we decide what to do with her." One of the men grabbed her arms, twisting them behind her back, binding her wrists with a rough piece of rope. The fibers cut into her skin. The preacher said he wanted her unharmed, the young one said, a note of unease in his voice. "The preacher ain't here," the leader said. He stepped toward Clara and grabbed a fistful of her hair, yanking her head back. "He just wants her back. He did not say in what condition." He stared at her, his sour whiskey breath hot on her face. "You look like you need to be taught a lesson, girl. Taught what happens to women who forget their place." He raised his gloved hand, preparing to strike her across the face. Clara tensed, shutting her eyes, bracing for the blow. The world exploded in a single deafening crack. It was not a slap. It was a rifle shot. The man holding her hair went rigid. A look of profound, stupid surprise crossed his face. He released her, a small, dark hole appearing on the front of his coat, just over his heart. He crumpled sideways into the snow and did not move. Clara screamed. "Get your gun!" the younger man yelled, diving behind a horse. The third man, who was still holding Clara's horse, fumbled for his pistol. A second shot rang out from the trees on the ridge. The bullet struck the man in the shoulder. He screamed, clutching the wound, and dropped his gun. Callum Reed stepped out of the trees. He was not the man from the cabin. He was not the man from the barn. This was the killer from Yuma. His face was a mask of cold, white rage. His rifle held steady in his hands. He walked down the slope, the snow crunching under his boots, his eyes fixed on the man hiding behind the horse. "Drop it!" Callum's voice was low, flat, and colder than the wind. The young man, terrified, tossed his revolver into the snow. The wounded man was sobbing, holding his shattered shoulder. "He is dead," the young man stammered, staring at his leader. "You killed him?" Get on your horse, Callum said, his voice void of any emotion. He walked past them, his rifle never wavering. He went straight to Clara. He did not look at her. He pulled his knife from his belt and, with one sharp, upward cut, severed the ropes on her wrists. He turned to the two remaining men. The young one was frozen in terror. The wounded one was bleeding badly into the snow.
Take him,
Callum nodded to the wounded man.
and ride. You ride back to Missouri. You tell the preacher, if he ever sends anyone for her again.
I will not send his men back. I will come for him. Do you understand me?
The young man nodded frantically. Yes, sir, we understand. We did not want. We were just hired.
Go! Callum roared.
The young man scrambled to his feet, hauled his wounded companion onto his horse, and fled the valley, riding east as fast as the snow would allow. Silence descended. It was absolute, broken only by the wind in the pines and the soft crackle of the fire the men had just built. The dead man lay staring at the gray sky, a dark stain spreading around him in the snow. Callum finally looked at Clara. She was on her knees, shaking so violently she could not stand. She was looking at the dead man, her face as white as the ground. He sheathed his knife, his rifle still in his hand, and knelt in front of her. He put his hand on her shoulder. She collapsed against him. All the fight, all the fear, all the desperate energy of the last 2 days vanishing in a single, ragged sob. She buried her face in his cold coat, her hands clutching his shirt, and wept. It was a sound of pure, abject terror, of a soul that had finally broken. Callum dropped the rifle and wrapped his arms around her. He held her tightly, his face buried in her hair, his own body trembling with the aftermath of the violence. His anger was gone, burned away by the kill, replaced by a fierce, protective, and terrifying tenderness. He just held her, rocking her gently, as she cried. "I am sorry," she gasped, her words muffled against his chest. "I am so sorry. Callum, I was trying to save you. I saw the poster, $500. I am sorry." "Shh," he said, his voice rough. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. Her skin was icy, her lips blue. He did not scold her. He did not yell. His gray eyes were filled with a profound, aching sadness. "You keep running away from being loved," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. Clara had no answer. She could only sob. Her guilt and his forgiveness a weight she could not bear. He stood, pulling her up with him. "We cannot stay here." He looked around the camp. The dead man, the fire, the 2 horses the men had left behind in their panic. "We will take their supplies," he said, his voice practical again, the killer receding. "And their horses. We need them." He worked quickly, his movements economical. Stripping the saddles and supplies, he did not touch the dead man. He found a half-full bottle of whiskey in one of the saddlebags, which he tucked into his own. "There is a cave," he said, his back to her. "Not far. Sheltered. We can hide there for the night." He helped her onto her horse, his touch impersonal but gentle. They left the valley, leaving the body for the wolves, and rode into the fading light. The cave was small, a deep, dry hollow in a granite cliff, hidden by a curtain of frozen pine branches. It was barely tall enough to stand in, but it was out of the wind. Callum led the horses into a deeper recess, where they were sheltered. He used the wood the preacher's men had gathered to build a fire just inside the mouth of the cave, the small space filled with warmth and flickering orange light. Clara sat on a bedroll, huddled in her blanket, her body still shaking, her mind numb. She watched him. He moved with a purpose, checking his rifle, tending the horses, making the small space secure. He was a man accustomed to violence, a man who knew how to survive it. He came and sat across the fire from her, handing her a piece of jerky and the whiskey bottle. "Drink,"
he ordered. She took it, her hands trembling. The fiery liquid burned its way down her throat, chasing some of the ice from her veins. She ate the jerky mechanically, without tasting it. She watched him. He was staring into the fire, his face grim. The man who had kissed her in the cabin seemed like a dream. This man, the one who had killed for her, was the reality.
"He was right,"
she whispered, her voice hoarse. Callum looked up, his eyes sharp. "Who?"
"Preacher Davies."
She looked down at her hands, at the raw, red burns the ropes had left on her wrists. "And Silas, all of them. They said I was spoiled, tainted, that I brought ruin." She looked at him, her eyes empty.
"Look what I have done. I did this. I brought them here. I got that man killed. I am what they said I am. I am not worthy of kindness, of a good man."
Tears streamed silently down her face. "I have always known it. Since I was a girl, my father, he said I was too willful, that I thought too much, that it would bring me to a bad end. He was right. I am not worthy of being saved." This was the core of it, the deep, rotten belief that had lived inside her since long before Red Bank. This was the truth she had been running from. Callum listened, his expression unreadable. The fire crackled, the only sound in the cave. He did not speak for a long time. Then, he slowly moved around the fire and knelt in front of her. He said nothing. He simply reached out and took her hands, the ones she had called unworthy. He turned them over, his thumbs gently rubbing the raw, chafed skin of her wrists. He was so close she could feel the heat from his body, smell the smoke and the faint, sharp scent of gunpowder on his coat. She flinched when he reached for the buttons of her dress. Her mind flashed to the man in the snow, his leering face. "Easy," Callum whispered. His touch was not brutal. It was not even the hungry passion of the cabin. It was something else. It was slow. It was gentle. He unbuttoned the stiff, frozen fabric and pushed the dress off her shoulders, exposing the thin linen of her chemise. He saw the dark, ugly bruises on her arms where the men had grabbed her. He saw the faint, yellowing mark on her cheek from the thief in Red Bank. Clara trembled, exposed, waiting for his judgment. He lowered his head. He pressed his lips, gently, to the darkest bruise on her shoulder. Clara gasped, a small, choked sound. He kissed the rope burn on her left wrist, his touch light, his breath warm. He kissed the mark on her arm. He raised his head and looked at her, his gray eyes holding hers. He leaned in and pressed his lips to the bruise on her cheek, a touch as soft as a prayer. He pulled her to her feet and wrapped her in his own bedroll, cocooning her in its warmth. He held her face between his hands. "You are wrong," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "You are not spoiled. You are not weak. You fought that drunk in the street with a rock. You faced down wolves. You spat in that man's face today, even when you were tied." He pulled her closer, his gaze burning into hers. "You fought for yourself long before I ever showed up. Clara, that is my kind of woman." He kissed her then, on the mouth. It was not a kiss of passion, but of sealing, a kiss of promise, a kiss that healed the raw, broken places inside her. He laid her down by the fire, wrapping the blankets tightly around them both. He pulled her against his chest, her back to him, his arms securely around her waist. He was her shield. He was her warmth. Clara let out a breath she felt she'd been holding her entire life. She was exhausted, bruised, and a man was dead because of her. But as she lay in Callum's arms, the firelight dancing on the cave walls, she did not feel like a fallen woman. She did not feel unworthy. She just felt his. They lay curled together, two fugitives, two survivors, a dead man behind them and a bounty ahead. Neither of them spoke of love. Neither of them had to. They simply held on, and in the deep, silent cold of the wilderness, they slept. They traveled south for 2 weeks, pushing the horses the preacher's men had left them. The land changed from snow-choked mountains to high, wind-scoured plains. The cold was a constant, biting companion, but the shared warmth of the cave lingered. A new, fragile quiet existed between them. The passion of the outpost and the terror of the rescue had given way to something more vulnerable. They were no longer just two people traveling for protection. They were a man and a woman who had seen the darkest parts of each other and had not turned away. He would ride close, his legs sometimes brushing hers, a silent, possessive contact. She would hand him his coffee in the morning, her fingers lingering on the cup. They were living in the small, unspoken spaces, terrified to name what was growing between them. Callum spoke of a town called Stone Creek, deep in the territory. "There is a woman there," he said, staring into the fire one night. "Martha Gideon, her husband. I helped her once, when some men tried to jump her claim after he died. She owes me nothing, but she is a square dealer. She might let us winter." It was a chance, a long, desperate chance. They arrived at Stone Creek under the cover of a freezing dusk. It was a small, quiet town, huddled against a frozen river. Callum left Clara with the horses in a grove of cottonwoods and walked into town. She waited for what felt like an eternity, the cold seeping into her bones, her fear a tight knot in her stomach. He returned, leading the horses. "It is done. She has a homestead, a mile north of town. She said we can use the old line shack." Martha Gideon was a woman carved from the same hard granite as the land. She was tall, in her late 40s, and her eyes held no judgment, only a deep, weary understanding of trouble. She looked at Callum, then at Clara, and nodded once. "The shack is cold," she said, her voice practical. "But the stove is good. I will bring you blankets. You," she said to Callum, "stay out of sight. I have neighbors, and they are curious. She," Martha nodded to Clara, "can help me in the house. No one will question a woman helping another." The line shack was small, just one room with a cot and a stove, but it was shelter. It was the first time they had been truly alone, in a place that was not a cave or a storm. That night, they did not just huddle for warmth. They came together with a slow, desperate tenderness, a confirmation of the life they had chosen, a sealing of the promise he had made. Life fell into a routine, something Clara had not known for months. It was a peaceful, healing rhythm. Every morning she would walk the quarter-mile to Martha's main house. She helped. She fed the chickens, kneaded bread in the warm, fragrant kitchen, mended clothes, and listened. Martha spoke little, but her presence was a balm. For the first time since she had left Missouri, Clara felt something other than fear. She felt useful. She watched Martha, a woman alone, running her own life, respected by her neighbors. It was a different kind of strength from Callum's, but it was strength all the same. Callum worked on the homestead, but he was a ghost. He stayed in the barn, mending tack, or rode to the far pastures to check the fences, always keeping to the low ground, always wearing his hat low. In the quiet afternoons, mending Martha's curtains, Clara would look out the window. She would see Callum chopping wood, his back muscles moving under his shirt, the rhythmic thunk of the axe, a solid, dependable sound. It was the sound of a man building a home, not a man running from a fight. She began to dream. She saw a small schoolhouse, not unlike her old one, but here, under a bigger sky. She saw the faces of children, eager to read. She would look at Callum, and a different, deeper image would form, one that made her blush in the cold air, the image of a child of her own, a child with his steady, gray eyes. The thought was so powerful, so terrifyingly sweet, it made her ache. They had 3 weeks of this quiet, 3 weeks where the bounty and the preacher seemed 1,000 miles away, a bad dream from another life. The peace shattered on a Tuesday. Martha returned from her weekly supply run in town. She did not unload the wagon. She walked straight to the line shack, her face a grim, pale mask. Callum was inside, cleaning his rifle. Clara was boiling coffee.
"There is a man,"
Martha said, her voice low, closing the door behind her.
"He is in town, at the saloon. He is not a local. He is quiet. He buys drinks for men, and he listens."
Callum stopped cleaning. He did not look up, but his entire body went still.
"He is asking questions,"
Martha continued, her hands twisting in her apron. "Asking about a drifter who might have passed through, a man with scars on his face. And he was asking about a woman, too, said she might be with him." Clara felt the floor drop out from under her.
"The bounty hunter. He's here,"
Clara whispered, her hand going to her throat.
"He found us."
"Maybe," Callum said, his voice flat. He began methodically reassembling the rifle. "Or maybe it is just talk."
"It is not just talk,
Callum," Martha said. "This man, he looks like he's hunting. He is not a drifter. He is watching. Everyone." That night, the shack was a prison. The peace was gone, replaced by the humming tension of a drawn wire. Callum sat on the cot, his gun belt on his lap, his gaze fixed on the door. The man she had seen in the kitchen, the man chopping wood, was gone. The killer from Yuma was back. Clara watched him, her heart breaking. This was his life. This was what he had to look forward to. Forever. A lifetime of listening, of waiting for the door to burst open. And it was because of her. The bounty hunter was asking about a woman. Too, she had made him easier to find. She waited until the blue light of the moon filled the small window, until she could not bear the silence any longer.
"I am going,"
she said, her voice a low, shaking whisper. Callum did not move. "You are not."
"He is here for you,"
she said, her words tumbling out, desperate.
"But those other men, they were here for me. If I go, if I turn myself in to the preacher."
He finally looked at her. His eyes were cold, dangerous. "Stop!" "No, listen," she insisted, kneeling in front of him. "It is the only way. I will ride east. I will find a marshal and tell him. I will tell him where I am going. The preacher will get word. He will call off his men. And this bounty hunter. Without me, you are a ghost again. You can disappear. He will lose your trail." "You think I cannot handle one bounty hunter?" he growled. "That is not the point. He will find you because of me. He is looking for a man and a woman. I am the one slowing you down. I am the one getting you killed." He stood up, towering over her. His anger a cold, palpable thing. "You are not leaving."
"Why?"
she cried, standing to face him.
"Because of your pride. Is that it?
You would rather stand and fight and die than let me do the one thing that can save you. This is your pride. Callum, your stupid, stubborn pride." "No!" he snarled, grabbing her arms. His grip was hard, almost painful. "It is not my pride. It is your shame." Clara flinched as if he had slapped her. "You still think you are that woman," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "The one the preacher pointed at. The one who is not worthy. You are still trying to disappear. You are still looking for a way to prove you are worthless. Something to be thrown away."
"That is not true,"
she sobbed. "It is. You are not running to save me. Clara, you are running because it is the only thing you know how to do. You are running away from being loved, just like I told you." He released her, pushing her back. He turned away from her, his whole body shaking with a fury that terrified her. "I will not let you," he said, his voice low and final. "I will tie you to this bed if I have to. You are not leaving." The argument hung in the air, broken and bleeding. Clara stared at his back, tears of anger and hurt streaming down her face. He did not understand. He did not see. He was so blinded by his own past that he could not see the logic in hers. A heavy, toxic silence filled the room. Clara retreated to the cot, wrapping a blanket around her, her body cold. Callum remained by the window, a dark silhouette against the moonlight, watching. An hour passed, then 2. The moon was high, casting sharp, black shadows across the snow. Callum had not moved. He was staring at the main house, at the barn. Clara's anger had cooled, leaving only a bone-deep dread. And then she saw it. She sat up, a shadow, a flicker of movement by Martha's woodpile. It was not a deer, it was a man.
Callum?
She whispered, her voice tight. He had already seen it. His hand was on his revolver. "Stay down," he commanded, "and stay quiet." The man moved from the woodpile, keeping low, slipping toward the barn. He was not heading for the house. He was not heading for their shack. He was heading for the barn.
"He thinks you are in the house,"
Clara whispered.
"He is going to wait in the barn, to ambush you in the morning."
"Or," Callum said, his voice grim, "he thinks I am already in the barn." A new, agonizing thought struck Clara. "Martha, is she—" "She is fine," Callum said. His voice clipped. "He is a hunter, not a killer of women. He is here for the bounty. For me. He must have seen me doing chores. He thinks I sleep in the barn." He checked his revolver, the click of the cylinder turning sounding impossibly loud in the small room.
"What are you going to do?"
she asked. "He is in the barn. He is waiting. I am not going to let him." He started for the door.
"No!"
Clara grabbed his arm.
"Callum, no! That is what he wants. He is waiting for you. He will kill you in the dark."
"I am not going to hide in here like a rat and wait for him to come for me," he said, his jaw set. "He is on her land. He is a threat to her. I am ending this."
"It is suicide."
"It is what has to be done." He pulled his arm from her grasp. "Lock this door behind me. Do not open it for anyone." He slipped out into the night, a shadow moving against shadows, his rifle in his hand. Clara ran to the window. Her heart was a cold, hard stone in her chest. She watched him, a dark shape, flitting between the tool shed and the fence line, circling, using the very land he had been tending to hunt the man who was hunting him. She saw the bounty hunter, a glimpse of him in the open barn doorway, also a shadow, waiting patiently.
This was it, a waiting game. 2 killers in the dark.
And then, everything happened at once. Callum was moving along the fence, trying to get a better angle. A dog at the neighbor's farm, a quarter-mile away, began to bark. A frantic, sudden noise. The bounty hunter in the barn tensed. He must have heard something. He stepped out of the shadow, his own rifle raised, trying to see what had spooked the dog. He saw Callum. He raised his rifle. Clara screamed, "Callum!" A flash of orange from the barn, the sound of the shot, a flat, hard crack that echoed off the frozen ground. Callum cried out, a sharp, ragged sound, and fell. He disappeared behind the fence line.
"No,"
Clara whimpered.
"No, no, no!"
The bounty hunter stepped out of the barn, reloading, walking cautiously toward the spot where Callum had fallen. Clara did not think. She did not feel. She acted. Martha's rifle was on the wall by the door, loaded. Callum had insisted on it. Clara grabbed it. It was heavy, long, and cold. She yanked the door open and ran onto the porch. The bounty hunter was halfway to the fence, his back to her, focused on his kill. Clara raised the rifle. She had shot a rifle only twice in her life, at tin cans, and had missed both times. The iron sight was a blur in the moonlight. She rested the barrel on the porch rail, just as she had seen Callum do. She put the shadow of the man in the sight and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The rifle stock slammed into her shoulder, knocking her backward onto the porch, the gun clattering on the boards. The world was filled with white, flashing spots. She had missed. The bullet kicked up snow 10 feet to the man's left. But it did not matter. The bounty hunter spun around, realizing he was not alone. The shot, a second, unexpected rifle, had exposed him. Lights flashed on in Martha's house. The front door flew open. Martha stood there, holding a lantern and a shotgun. "Who is out there?" she boomed. From the neighboring farm, a man shouted, "What in God's name is that shooting?" The bounty hunter was caught. He was exposed, outnumbered, his target down. He did not hesitate. He was a professional. He turned and fled, disappearing into the darkness of the river gully. Clara did not wait. She scrambled to her feet and ran, shoeless, through the snow, toward the fence. "Callum! Callum!" She found him. He was on his side, his rifle in the snow, trying to push himself up. His hands were dark, wet. He got me," he gasped, his voice tight with pain. "Where?" she cried, her hands fluttering over him, terrified to touch him. "My side," he breathed. It is bad, Clara."
"Martha!"
Clara shrieked, her voice cracking.
"Help me! He is shot! Help me!"
They got him inside, half carrying, half dragging him, leaving a dark, smeared trail in the snow. They laid him on the cot, which was instantly soaked in blood. "Get the lamp," Martha ordered, her voice calm and steady, cutting through Clara's panic. "And the whiskey from my kitchen. Get all the clean rags you can find. And the kettle, put it on the stove. Now, Clara, run!" The next 8 hours were a blur of smoke, steam, and blood. The bullet was in him. It was deep in his left side, just below the ribs. "We have to get it out," Martha said, her face grim, as she cut away his shirt. Clara's hands were covered in his blood. She pressed a cloth to the wound, but it soaked through, again and again. He was pale, his skin clammy, his breathing shallow.
"I cannot,"
Clara wept, her body shaking so hard she could barely hold the cloth.
"I cannot. Martha, I will kill him."
"He will die if we do not," Martha said, her voice hard. "He is bleeding inside. Now, you hold that lamp steady, and you talk to him. You keep him here. I will do the cutting." Clara held the lamp, her knuckles white. She watched as Martha probed the wound with a sterilized knife. Callum arched off the cot, a raw, inhuman sound tearing from his throat, and then he went limp. "Hold him," Martha ordered. Clara dropped the lamp and threw her body over his chest, holding him down, her face pressed against his.
"I am here,"
she whispered, her tears dripping onto his face.
"I am here, Callum. Do not leave me. Please do not leave me. I am so sorry. This is my fault, all my fault. Please, I love you. Do not die."
She said it over and over, a desperate prayer, a confession. Martha grunted, her hand deep in the wound. "Got it." She pulled her hand back, and a small, flattened piece of lead dropped into the tin bowl with a clang. "Now," Martha said, "we stitch him, and we pray." Clara did not leave his side. She sat by the cot, bathed in the smell of blood and whiskey, and watched him breathe. Martha had stitched the wound, inside and out. His fever spiked. He shivered and thrashed, lost in a dark, violent world, calling out names she did not know. She held his hand. She wiped his face with a cool cloth. She sat, and she watched, and she willed him to live. Sometime in the dark, cold hours just before dawn, his eyes opened. The fever had not broken, but he was lucid. He saw her. His hand, dry and burning, weakly gripped hers. "Clara," he rasped. "I am here," she sobbed, lowering her head to his chest.
"I am here. Please, please do not die."
His thumb stroked the back of her hand, a small, weak movement. You fired," he whispered.
"I missed,"
she cried.
"I missed him."
A small, pained smile touched his lips. Did not matter. That's my kind of woman. He coughed, a terrible wet sound that sent a fresh wave of red to his lips. Clara wiped it away, her body shaking.
Do not leave me,
she begged.
please.
He looked at her, his eyes clear, holding hers. He saw her terror, her love, her guilt. Have to live, he whispered, his voice a thread. You are worth living for. His eyes closed. His hand went limp in hers, but his breathing, though shallow, was steady. The shivering had stopped. Clara laid her head on his chest and, for the first time in a night that had lasted a lifetime, she wept, not in terror, but in a small, desperate sliver of hope. He healed, slowly, painfully. For 10 days, Clara and Martha nursed him. The fever broke, returned, and broke again. Clara learned to clean the wound, to change the dressings, to feed him broth, to hold him steady when the pain made him cry out. She watched the color return to his face, the strength creep back into his hands. On the 11th day, he sat up by himself, his back against the wall. Clara was sitting in the chair, mending his torn shirt. He watched her for a long time. He will be back, Callum said. His voice was stronger. Clara nodded, not looking up.
I know.
This place, he said, looking around the shack. It is not safe, not for us, not for Martha. I know, she said again. We cannot run west, he said. That bounty. Vance will have men in every territory by now. We will always be looking over our shoulder. And your preacher, he will not stop. He sent those men once. He will send them again. Clara put the shirt down. She finally looked at him. The man who had faced her down, his eyes cold with anger, was gone. The man in his place was tired, scarred, but his eyes were clear. Running did not work, she said quietly. Hiding did not work. She stood up and walked to the window. She looked out at the snow, at the barn, at the fence line where he had fallen. She thought of his words. It is your shame. He was right. She had been so ashamed of what had been done to her, so convinced of her own unworthiness, that she had been willing to throw her own life away. She had been willing to throw his life away. But the woman who had grabbed that rifle, who had fired at the shadow, who had held him down while Martha cut the bullet out of him, that woman was not ashamed. That woman was angry. She turned back to him. You were right, she said. About my shame. I am done being ashamed. A slow smile touched Callum's lips. Good.
That preacher,
she said, her voice hard.
He is the one who should be running.
Callum watched her. He saw the teacher from Missouri, the girl who had fought with a rock, and the woman who had saved his life, all standing there as one. We go back, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she said. To your town. She took a deep breath, the first one that felt full and clean since she had fled Missouri. Together, she said. Together, he agreed. The ride back to Missouri was a quiet act of shared resolve. They traveled east, back into the civilization that had rejected them both. The landscape changing from the hard, open honesty of the plains to the rolling, wooded hills of the border states. Callum's wound was a raw, red line on his side, a constant, pulling pain. Clara tended to it every night, her touch gentle, practical, and proprietary. The shame that had driven her was gone, burned away by the rifle shot and the long nights spent bargaining with his fever. The man who rode beside her was no longer a fugitive she was tied to. He was the man she had claimed. Callum, for his part, watched her. He saw the new hardness in her eyes, the set of her jaw. She was no longer the frightened, haunted woman he had found in Red Bank. She was returning to her home not as a victim, but as a judge. He was riding with her, a wanted man, into the one place he should not be, and he had never felt more certain of his direction. They arrived in her old town on a Saturday afternoon, just before dusk. The steeple of the First Presbyterian Church was the first thing they saw, a sharp black finger pointing at a gray, unforgiving sky. Clara reined in her horse at the top of Main Street. It was all so familiar, and yet so alien. The Mercantile, the bank where Silas worked, the small, neat houses with their white picket fences. It was a town built on secrets and silent judgments. They rode down the street. The town stopped. Mrs. Gable, who was sweeping the porch of her boarding house, froze, her broom clattering to the boards. Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith, paused, his hammer held aloft, his eyes wide. At the window of the bank, the curtain moved, and Clara saw the pale, terrified face of Silas, her former fiancé, before he vanished into the shadows. Whispers started, moving from porch to porch, across the street. "It is her. That is Clara Monroe. Sakes alive." The whispers changed as they looked at the man beside her. They saw the scars on his face, the gun on his hip, the hard, unyielding way he met their stares. "Who is that?" "A gunslinger. Look at his face. She has brought a sinner." Clara ignored them. She held her head high, her gaze fixed straight ahead. She had not come back for their approval. She had come back for her name. They stopped at the livery. The stable hand, a young man named Timothy, stared at her as if he had seen a ghost. "We need our horses boarded," Callum said, his voice low and steady. "And a room. Is Mrs. Gable's house still open?"
"Yes, sir,"
Timothy stammered. They walked from the livery to the boarding house, their saddlebags over their shoulders. Mrs. Gable stood on the porch, her arms crossed, her face a mask of pinched disapproval.
"Clara Monroe,"
she said, her voice cold.
"we thought you were dead."
"I am not," Clara said.
"And him?"
She nodded at Callum.
"He is with me," Clara said. "We need a room."
"I do not know." Mrs. Gable began. "A woman, unmarried, with a man like—" "We will pay for 2 rooms," Callum interrupted, his voice flat. He dropped $4 silver onto the small table by the door. "For the week." The sight of the money, more than a month's rent, silenced her. She took the coins.
"3rd floor," she said, her voice tight. "At the end of the hall, separate."
They spent the night in the stifling, civilized quiet. The town buzzed around them. They could hear the hurried footsteps on the street, the murmur of voices. A delegation had gone to Preacher Davies. The fallen woman had returned, and she had brought a demon with her. The next morning, the church bell rang, not with its usual steady call to worship, but with a frantic, angry clangor. It was a summons. Clara stood at the window of her small room. Below, in the town square, people were gathering. They were not filing into the church. Preacher Davies, sensing the moment, was bringing his judgment to the people. He stood on the steps of the town hall, his Bible in his hand, his face dark with a righteous fury.
"He is going to do it here,"
Clara whispered.
"He is going to make a spectacle."
Callum came up behind her. He had not slept. He had sat in his chair all night, his gun resting on his thigh. He put his hands on her shoulders. "You do not have to go." She turned and looked at him. She reached up and touched the scar on his neck, the one his father had given him. "You showed me your scars." She said, "Now I have to show them mine." They walked down the stairs and out into the bright, cold morning. The town square was full. Hundreds of people stood waiting, their faces a mix of fear, curiosity, and cruel anticipation. They parted as Clara and Callum walked through them, a path of whispers and stares. They stopped at the edge of the crowd, facing the preacher. Preacher Davies saw her. A look of triumph, dark and possessive, crossed his face. This was what he wanted. His stray lamb, his sinner, returned for public shearing. We are blessed this day, he boomed, his voice rolling over the silent crowd. We are blessed, for the Lord has shown us a sign. He has returned the lost sheep to the fold, so that we may see the wages of sin. He pointed a long, damning finger directly at Clara. Jezebel, she who was a teacher, she who we trusted with our daughters, has returned. She fled our godly town, fled the correction of the Lord, and she has walked in the wilderness with Satan. His finger moved to Callum, who stood still as stone beside her. Look at the company she keeps, a man scarred by depravity, a killer, a fugitive from the law. She has returned, not in penance, but in defiance, bringing her sin with her. The crowd murmured, their fear turning to anger. She is a harlot, a man shouted. Corrupter, a woman cried. The preacher raised his hands, silencing them, a dark smile on his lips. She must be cleansed. She must be admonished. She must be cast out, so that her stain does not poison us all. Let her kneel. Let her kneel before this congregation and beg forgiveness. Clara trembled. For 1 second, the old, bone-deep terror seized her. She felt the urge to run, to hide, to disappear. Then she felt Callum's hand find hers. His grip was solid, warm, and real. It was the hand that had cleaned her wounds, the hand that had held her in the storm, the hand that had taken a bullet for her. She squeezed his hand and stepped forward. No, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it cut through the preacher's fervor like a knife. The crowd went silent, stunned. What did you say, child? The preacher asked, his smile faltering. I said no, Clara repeated, stepping out into the open space, pulling Callum with her. She stood tall, her head high, her eyes meeting the preacher's. I will not kneel, and I will not beg forgiveness, for I have committed no sin. She turned to the crowd, to the people she had known her entire life. I was your teacher, she said, her voice gaining strength. I taught your daughters. I taught them to read, not just the Bible, but poetry. I taught them to think, and for that, this man, your preacher, called me a corrupter. She looked into the crowd, her eyes finding Silas. He tried to look away, but she held his gaze. He turned my friends against me. He turned the man I was to marry against me. He stood right there. She pointed to the bank, and called me vain and unwomanly, to save his own position. Silas went white. You ran me out of town, Clara continued, her voice ringing with the injustice. You cast me out with nothing. I was robbed, I starved, I was hunted, and when I had found a small measure of peace, this man, she pointed back to Davies, sent brutes to drag me back. He did not send the sheriff. He sent hired men who tied me up and would have done worse. The crowd was stirring, murmurs of shock replacing their anger. This man beside me, she said, her voice softening as she looked at Callum, is not a demon. He is the man who saved my life from them. He is the man who took a bullet that was meant for me. Callum stepped forward slightly, his scarred face hard, his gray eyes sweeping the crowd. I am a fugitive, he said, his voice a low gravel. That is true, and I have killed men. But I have killed men for far less noble reasons than what this town, and that preacher, did to this woman. A woman at the front of the crowd, Mrs. Albright, whose daughter had been Clara's best student, spoke up. She is right, she said, her voice shaking. My Mary, she loved Miss Monroe. She just taught her books. There was no sin in it. He told us she was a harlot, a man shouted, confused. He lied, Clara cried. Preacher Davies's face was purple with rage. He was losing them. His authority, his entire world, was crumbling. Lies, he roared, striding forward. Lies from a painted whore. She speaks of sin. Look at her, living in filth with a murderer. There is a bounty on his head, $500. He is a wanted man, and she has brought him here. She has brought his sin, his violence, into our homes.
You dare speak of sin?
Callum's voice was quiet, but it was so cold, so dangerous, that the entire square went silent. Callum let go of Clara's hand and took 2 steps toward the preacher, who involuntarily recoiled. You talk of my sins. Callum said, I have paid for mine, in a prison cell. Let us talk of yours. Clara knew what was coming. She had told him, in the dead of night, in the safety of the line shack, her last and darkest secret.
This is a lie,
Davies stammered. I am a man of God. You are a man, Callum countered. You tell this town what you did. Tell them about the night you came to the schoolhouse, after you had publicly condemned her. Tell them how you found her alone, packing her things. Callum's eyes bored into the preacher. Tell them what you offered her. You said you could protect her. You said you could speak on her behalf, calm the town. All she had to do was comply. All she had to do was submit to you, in private. The crowd gasped. This was a sin they understood. It was not theology, it was power and filth.
You lie,
Davies shrieked, his composure shattering.
She is the liar. She is the serpent.
I am not, Clara said, her voice breaking, but strong. She stepped up beside Callum. He is telling the truth. He told me it was the only way to save my reputation. Tears streamed down her face. He put his hands on me. I ran that night and I never stopped. Until now. It was over. The preacher's face contorted, his self-righteous mask completely gone, revealing the writhing, ugly thing beneath. He was ruined, exposed. With a scream that was more animal than human, he lunged. He was not lunging at Callum. He was lunging at Clara, the source of his humiliation. Callum moved. He was not the scarred man from the bar brawl. He was not the desperate prisoner. He was a protector. He moved with a speed that defied belief, stepping in front of Clara, his hand a blur. His gun was out. The click of the hammer being pulled back echoed across the square. He did not fire. The barrel of his revolver was pressed squarely against the preacher's sweating forehead. Davies froze. His hands clawed, his eyes wide with terror. Callum held him there, his hand steady, his gaze holding the preacher's. The crowd watched, breathless. Callum had the power of life and death in his hand. He was the killer they had feared. And he did nothing. Slowly, deliberately, he eased the hammer down. He holstered his weapon. He is not worth it, he said, his voice filled with contempt. 2 men from the crowd, Mr. Henderson and Silas's father, the bank president, surged forward. They grabbed the preacher's arms. Davies began to sob. A pathetic, broken sound. Take him, a new voice said. The sheriff, Eli Cobb, stepped into the circle. He had been watching the entire time from the steps of his office. He looked at the preacher, his face disgusted. Take him to the jail. He can pray there. The men dragged the sobbing preacher away. The crowd was silent, ashamed. Sheriff Cobb turned to Clara. He removed his hat. Miss Monroe, he said, his voice respectful. On behalf of this town, I apologize. You have committed no crime here. You are free to go. He then turned to Callum. He looked at the gun on his hip, at the scars, and then at the way he stood beside Clara. Sir, the sheriff said, there is the matter of a bounty from the Vance family. I know, Callum said. I have seen a wanted man here today, the sheriff said, his voice raising for the crowd to hear. I saw him draw a weapon on an unarmed man, but I also saw him show a restraint that many godly men lack. I saw him defend a citizen of this town, and I saw him risk his own freedom to see justice done. He looked at the crowd. This bounty has no power in Harmony. The Vance family's money is not welcome here. We will not harbor a fugitive, but we will not persecute a man of honor. As far as this town is concerned, you are a free man. He looked at the stunned faces. Does any man here disagree?
Does any man wish to collect that $500? Silence. Mrs. Albright, her eyes wet, stepped forward and touched Clara's arm. Welcome home, dear, she whispered. Callum put his arm around Clara's waist. She leaned against him, her body boneless with relief. It was over. They did not stay. They collected their horses, and as the sun began to dip below the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they rode out of town. They rode west, back toward the open plains, the red sky ahead of them. They were, finally, free. By the next spring, they had found their place. It was a small, fertile valley in a new territory, carved by a wide, clear river. The nearest town was 2 days' ride, and that suited them both. Callum built a cabin. He was good with his hands. He felled the trees, notched the logs, and built a fireplace from river stones. It was solid, sturdy, and safe. Clara started a school. She used the one spare room in their cabin. She taught the children of the few other settlers in the valley, families who were more interested in their children learning sums than in the past of the new schoolteacher. One night, the first snow of the new winter was falling outside, soft and quiet. A fire crackled in the stone hearth Callum had built. Clara was reading by the light, and Callum was sitting, cleaning his rifle, the old habit of a lifetime. The cabin was warm, filled with the smell of pine and coffee. Clara put her book down. She watched him, his scarred hands moving over the steel, the firelight catching the gray in his hair. He was a good man. He was her man. "Callum," she whispered. He looked up, his eyes soft in the warm light. She smiled, a small, shy smile. "You still think I am your kind of woman?" He put the rifle down and stood up. He crossed the small room and pulled her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her close. He kissed her forehead, then her hair. He held her, simply feeling the warmth and the rightness of her in his arms. "Now," he whispered against her skin, "and always." Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to From Wild West for more stories. We invite you to share your thoughts in English,